Section 1 of All the Sad Young Men. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by SKVeld. All the Sad Young Men by F. Scott Fitzgerald. The Rich Boy, Part 1. Begin with an individual, and before you know it, you find that you have created a type. Begin with a type, and you find that you have created nothing. That is, because we are all queer fish, queerer behind our faces and voices than we want anyone to know, or than we know ourselves. When I hear a man proclaiming himself an average, honest, open fellow, I feel pretty sure that he has some definite and perhaps terrible abnormality which he has agreed to conceal, and his protestation of being average and honest and open is his way of reminding himself of his misprision. There are no types, no plurals. There is a rich boy, and this is his and not his brother's story. All my life I have lived among his brothers, but this one has been my friend. Besides, if I wrote about his brothers, I should have to begin by attacking all the lies that the poor have told about the rich, and the rich have told about themselves. Such a wild structure they have erected that when we pick up a book about the rich, some instinct prepares us for unreality. Even the intelligent and impassioned reporters of life have made the country of the rich as unreal as fairyland. Let me tell you about the very rich. They are different from you and me. They possess and enjoy early, and it does something to them, makes them soft where we are hard, and cynical where we are trustful, in a way that, unless you were born rich, it is very difficult to understand. They think, deep in their hearts, that they are better than we are, because we had to discover the compensations and refuges of life for ourselves. Even when they enter deep into our world, or sink below us, they still think that they are better than we are. They are different. The only way I can describe young Anson Hunter is to approach him as if he were a foreigner and cling stubbornly to my point of view. If I accept his for a moment, I am lost. I have nothing to show but a preposterous movie. 2. Anson was the eldest of 6 children who would someday divide a fortune of $15 million. And he reached the age of reason, is it 7? At the beginning of the century, when daring young women were already gliding along Fifth Avenue in electric mobiles. In those days, he and his brother had an English governess who spoke the language very clearly and crisply and well, so that the 2 boys grew to speak as she did. Their words and sentences were all crisp and clear, and not run together as ours are. They didn't talk exactly like English children, but acquired an accent that is peculiar to fashionable people in the city of New York. In the summer, the 6 children were moved from the big house on 71st Street to a big estate in northern Connecticut. It was not a fashionable locality. Anson's father wanted to delay as long as possible his children's knowledge of that side of life. He was a man somewhat superior to his class, which composed New York society, and to his period, which was the snobbish and formalized vulgarity of the Gilded Age. And he wanted his sons to learn habits of concentration and have sound constitutions and grow up into right living and successful men. He and his wife kept an eye on them as well as they were able until the 2 older boys went away to school. But in huge establishments, this is difficult. It was much simpler in the series of small and medium-sized houses in which my own youth was spent. I was never far out of the reach of my mother's voice, of the sense of her presence, her approval or disapproval. Anson's first sense of his superiority came to him when he realized the half-grudging American deference that was paid to him in the Connecticut village. The parents of the boys he played with always inquired after his father and mother, and were vaguely excited when their own children were asked to the Hunter's house. He accepted this as the natural state of things, and a sort of impatience with all groups of which he was not the center, in money, in position, in authority, remained with him for the rest of his life. He disdained to struggle with other boys for precedence. He expected it to be given him freely, and when it wasn't, he withdrew into his family. His family was sufficient, for in the East money is still a somewhat feudal thing, a clan-forming thing. In the snobbish West, money separates families to form sets. At 18, when he went to New Haven, Anson was tall and thick-set, with a clear complexion and a healthy color from the ordered life he had led in school. His hair was yellow and grew in a funny way on his head. His nose was beaked. These two things kept him from being handsome. But he had a confident charm and a certain brusque style, and the upper-class men who passed him on the street knew without being told that he was a rich boy and had gone to one of the best schools. Nevertheless, his very superiority kept him from being a success in college. The independence was mistaken for egotism, and the refusal to accept Yale standards with the proper awe seemed to belittle all those who had. So, long before he graduated, he began to shift the center of his life to New York. He was at home in New York. There was his own house with the kind of servants you can't get anymore, and his own family, of which, because of his good humor and a certain ability to make things go, he was rapidly becoming the center, and the debutante parties, and the correct manly world of the men's clubs, and the occasional wild spree with the gallant girls whom New Haven only knew from the fifth row. His aspirations were conventional enough. They included even the irreproachable shadow he would someday marry. But they differed from the aspirations of the majority of young men, in that there was no mist over them. None of that quality which is variously known as idealism or illusion. Anson accepted without reservation the world of high finance and high extravagance, of divorce and dissipation, of snobbery and of privilege. Most of our lives end as a compromise. It was as a compromise that his life began. He and I first met in the late summer of 1917, when he was just out of Yale and, like the rest of us, was swept up into the systematized hysteria of the war. In the blue-green uniform of the naval aviation, he came down to Pensacola, where the hotel orchestras played "I'm Sorry, Dear," and we young officers danced with the girls. Everyone liked him, and though he ran with the drinkers and wasn't an especially good pilot, even the instructors treated him with a certain respect. He was always having long talks with them in his confident, logical voice, talks which ended by his getting himself, or more frequently another officer, out of some impending trouble. He was convivial, bawdy, robustly avid for pleasure, and we were all surprised when he fell in love with a conservative and rather proper girl. Her name was Paula Legendre, a dark, serious beauty from somewhere in California. Her family kept a winter residence just outside of town, and in spite of her primness, she was enormously popular. There is a large class of men whose egotism can't endure humor in a woman. But Anson wasn't that sort, and I couldn't understand the attraction of her sincerity. That was the thing to say about her, for his keen and somewhat sardonic mind. Nevertheless, they fell in love, and on her terms. He no longer joined the twilight gathering at the DeSoto bar, and whenever they were seen together, they were engaged in a long, serious dialogue, which must have gone on several weeks. Long afterward, he told me that it was not about anything in particular, but was composed on both sides of immature and even meaningless statements. The emotional content that gradually came to fill it grew up not out of the words, but out of its enormous seriousness. It was a sort of hypnosis. Often it was interrupted, giving way to that emasculated humor we call fun. When they were alone, it was resumed again, solemn, low-keyed, and pitched so as to give each other a sense of unity in feeling and thought. They came to resent any interruptions of it, to be unresponsive to facetiousness about life, even to the mild cynicism of their contemporaries. They were only happy when the dialogue was going on, and its seriousness bathed them like the amber glow of an open fire. Toward the end, there came an interruption they did not resent. It began to be interrupted by passion. Oddly enough, Anson was as engrossed in the dialogue as she was, and as profoundly affected by it, yet at the same time aware that on his side much was insincere, and on hers much was merely simple. At first, too, he despised her emotional simplicity as well. But with his love, her nature deepened and blossomed, and he could despise it no longer. He felt that if he could enter into Paula's warm, safe life, he would be happy. The long preparation of the dialogue removed any constraint. He taught her some of what he had learned from more adventurous women, and she responded with a rapt, holy intensity. One evening after a dance, they agreed to marry, and he wrote a long letter about her to his mother. The next day, Paula told him that she was rich, that she had a personal fortune of nearly $1 million. 3. It was exactly as if they could say, neither of us has anything, we shall be poor together. Just as delightful that they should be rich instead. It gave them the same communion of adventure. Yet when Anson got leave in April and Paula and her mother accompanied him north, she was impressed with the standing of his family in New York and with the scale on which they lived. Alone with Anson for the first time in the rooms where he had played as a boy, she was filled with a comfortable emotion, as though she were preeminently safe and taken care of. The pictures of Anson in a skull cap at his first school, of Anson on horseback with the sweetheart of a mysterious forgotten summer, of Anson in a gay group of ushers and bridesmaid at a wedding, made her jealous of his life apart from her in the past. And so completely did his authoritative person seem to sum up and typify these possessions of his, that she was inspired with the idea of being married immediately and returning to Pensacola as his wife. But an immediate marriage wasn't discussed. Even the engagement was to be secret until after the war. When she realized that only 2 days of his leave remained, her dissatisfaction crystallized in the intention of making him as unwilling to wait as she was. They were driving to the country for dinner, and she determined to force the issue that night. Now, a cousin of Paula's was staying with them at the Ritz, a severe, bitter girl who loved Paula but was somewhat jealous of her impressive engagement, and as Paula was late in dressing, the cousin, who wasn't going to the party, received Anson in the parlor of the suite. Anson had met friends at 5 o'clock and drunk freely and indiscreetly with them for an hour. He left the Yale Club at a proper time, and his mother's chauffeur drove him to the Ritz, but his usual capacity was not in evidence, and the impact of the steam-heated sitting room made him suddenly dizzy. He knew it, and he was both amused and sorry. Paula's cousin was 25, but she was exceptionally naive, and at first failed to realize what was up. She had never met Anson before, and she was surprised when he mumbled strange information and nearly fell off his chair. But until Paula appeared, it didn't occur to her that what she had taken for the odor of a dry-cleaned uniform was really whiskey. But Paula understood as soon as she appeared. Her only thought was to get Anson away before her mother saw him, and at the look in her eyes, the cousin understood too. When Paula and Anson descended to the limousine, they found 2 men inside, both asleep. They were the men with whom he had been drinking at the Yale Club, and they were also going to the party. He had entirely forgotten their presence in the car. On the way to Hempstead, they awoke and sang. Some of the songs were rough, and though Paula tried to reconcile herself to the fact that Anson had few verbal inhibitions, her lips tightened with shame and distaste. Back at the hotel, the cousin, confused and agitated, considered the incident, and then walked into Mrs. Legend's bedroom, saying, "Isn't he funny?" "Who is funny?" "Why, Mr. Hunter, he seemed so funny." Mrs. Legend looked at her sharply. "How is he funny?" "Why, he said he was French. I didn't know he was French." "That's absurd. You must have misunderstood." She smiled. "It was a joke." The cousin shook her head stubbornly. "No, he said he was brought up in France. He said he couldn't speak any English and that's why he couldn't talk to me. And he couldn't." Mrs. Legend looked away with impatience, just as the cousin added thoughtfully, "Perhaps it was because he was so drunk," and walked out of the room. This curious report was true. Anson, finding his voice thick and uncontrollable, had taken the unusual refuge of announcing that he spoke no English. Years afterward, he used to tell that part of the story, and he invariably communicated the uproarious laughter which the memory aroused in him. 5 times in the next hour, Mrs. Legend tried to get Hempstead on the phone. When she succeeded, there was a 10-minute delay before she heard Paula's voice on the wire. Cousin Joe told me Anson was intoxicated. Oh, no. Oh, yes. Cousin Joe says he was intoxicated. He told her he was French and he fell off his chair and behaved as if he was very intoxicated. I don't want you to come home with him. Mother, he's all right. Please don't worry about. But I do worry. I think it's dreadful. I want you to promise me not to come home with him. I'll take care of it, Mother. I don't want you to come home with him. All right, Mother. Goodbye. Be sure now, Paula. Ask someone to bring you. Deliberately, Paula took the receiver from her ear and hung it up. Her face was flushed with helpless annoyance. Anson was stretched out asleep in a bedroom upstairs, while the dinner party below was proceeding lamely toward conclusion. The hour's drive had sobered him somewhat. His arrival was merely hilarious, and Paula hoped that the evening was not spoiled after all. But 2 imprudent cocktails before dinner completed the disaster. He talked boisterously and somewhat offensively to the party at large for 15 minutes, and then slid silently under the table, like a man in an old print. But, unlike an old print, it was all rather horrible without being at all quaint. None of the young girls present remarked upon the incident. It seemed to merit only silence. His uncle and 2 other men carried him upstairs, and it was just after this that Paula was called to the phone. An hour later, Anson awoke in a fog of nervous energy, through which he perceived after a moment the figure of his Uncle Robert standing by the door. I said, are you better? What? Do you feel better, old man? Terrible, said Anson. I'm going to try you on another bromo seltzer. If you can hold it down, it'll do you good to sleep. With an effort, Anson slid his legs from the bed and stood up. I'm all right, he said dully. Take it easy. I think if you gave me a glass brandy, I could go downstairs. Oh, no. Yes, that's the only thing. I'm all right now. I suppose I'm in Dutch there. They know you're a little under the weather, said his uncle deprecatingly. But don't worry about it. Schuyler didn't even get here. He passed away in the locker room over at the Lynx. Indifferent to any opinion, except Paula's, Anson was nevertheless determined to save the debris of the evening. But when after a cold bath he made his appearance, most of the party had already left. Paula got up immediately to go home. In the limousine, the old serious dialogue began. She had known that he drank, she admitted, but she had never expected anything like this. It seemed to her that perhaps they were not suited to each other after all. Their ideas about life were too different, and so forth. When she finished speaking, Anson spoke in turn, very soberly. Then Paula said she'd have to think it over. She wouldn't decide tonight. She was not angry, but she was terribly sorry. Nor would she let him come into the hotel with her. But just before she got out of the car, she leaned and kissed him unhappily on the cheek. The next afternoon, Anson had a long talk with Mrs. Legendre while Paula sat listening in silence. It was agreed that Paula was to brood over the incident for a proper period, and then, if mother and daughter thought it best, they would follow Anson to Pensacola. On his part, he apologized with sincerity and dignity. That was all. With every card in her hand, Mrs. Legendre was unable to establish any advantage over him. He made no promises, showed no humility, only delivered a few serious comments on life, which brought him off with rather a moral superiority at the end. When they came south 3 weeks later, neither Anson in his satisfaction nor Paula in her relief at the reunion realized that the psychological moment had passed forever. 4. He dominated and attracted her, and at the same time filled her with anxiety. Confused by his mixture of solidity and self-indulgence, of sentiment and cynicism, incongruities which her gentle mind was unable to resolve, Paula grew to think of him as 2 alternating personalities. When she saw him alone, or at a formal party, or with his casual inferiors, she felt a tremendous pride in his strong, attractive presence. the paternal understanding stature of his mind. In other company, she became uneasy when what had been a fine imperviousness to mere gentility showed its other face. The other face was gross, humorous, reckless of everything but pleasure. It startled her mind temporarily away from him, even led her into a short covert experiment with an old beau. But it was no use. After 4 months of Anson's enveloping vitality, there was an anemic pallor in all other men. In July, he was ordered abroad, and their tenderness and desire reached a crescendo. Paula considered a last-minute marriage, decided against it only because there were always cocktails on his breath now, but the parting itself made her physically ill with grief. After his departure, she wrote him long letters of regret for the days of love they had missed by waiting. In August, Anson's plane slipped down into the North Sea. He was pulled onto a destroyer after a night in the water and sent to hospital with pneumonia. The armistice was signed before he was finally sent home. Then, with every opportunity given back to them, with no material obstacle to overcome, the secret weavings of their temperaments came between them, drying up their kisses and their tears, making their voices less loud to one another, muffling the intimate chatter of their hearts until the old communication was only possible by letters from far away. One afternoon, a society reporter waited for 2 hours in the hunter's house for a confirmation of their engagement. Anson denied it. Nevertheless, an early issue carried the report as a leading paragraph. They were constantly seen together at Southampton, Hot Springs, and Tuxedo Park. But the serious dialogue had turned a corner into a long-sustained quarrel, and the affair was almost played out. Anson got drunk flagrantly and missed an engagement with her, whereupon Paula made certain behavioristic demands. His despair was helpless before his pride and his knowledge of himself. The engagement was definitely broken. "Dearest," said their letters now, "dearest, dearest, when I wake up in the middle of the night and realize that after all it was not to be, I feel that I want to die. I can't go on living any more. Perhaps when we meet this summer we may talk things over and decide differently. We were so excited and sad that day, and I don't feel that I can live all my life without you. You speak of other people. Don't you know there are no other people for me, but only you?" But as Paula drifted here and there around the East, she would sometimes mention her gaieties to make him wonder. Anson was too acute to wonder. When he saw a man's name in her letters, he felt more sure of her and a little disdainful. He was always superior to such things. But he still hoped that they would someday marry. Meanwhile, he plunged vigorously into all the movement and glitter of postbellum New York, entering a brokerage house, joining 6 clubs, dancing late and moving in 3 worlds. His own world, the world of young Yale graduates, and that section of the half-world which rests one end on Broadway. But there was always a thorough and infractable 8 hours devoted to his work in Wall Street, where the combination of his influential family connection, his sharp intelligence, and his abundance of sheer physical energy brought him almost immediately forward. He had one of those invaluable minds with partitions in it. Sometimes he appeared at his office refreshed by less than an hour's sleep, but such occurrences were rare. So early as 1920, his income in salary and commissions exceeded $12,000. As the Yale tradition slipped into the past, he became more and more of a popular figure among his classmates in New York, more popular than he had ever been in college. He lived in a great house and had the means of introducing young men into other great houses. Moreover, his life already seemed secure, while theirs, for the most part, had arrived again at precarious beginnings. They commenced to turn to him for amusement and escape, and Anson responded readily, taking pleasure in helping people and arranging their affairs. There were no men in Paula's letters now, but a note of tenderness ran through them that had not been there before. From several sources he heard that she had a heavy beau, Lowell Thayer, a Bostonian of wealth and position, and though he was sure she still loved him, it made him uneasy to think that he might lose her after all. Save for one unsatisfactory day, she had not been in New York for almost 5 months, and as the rumors multiplied, he became increasingly anxious to see her. In February, he took his vacation and went down to Florida. Palm Beach sprawled plump and opulent between the sparkling sapphire of Lake Worth, flawed here and there by houseboats at anchor, and the great turquoise bar of the Atlantic Ocean. The huge bulks of the breakers and the Royal Poinciana rose as twin ponches from the bright level of the sand, and around them clustered the Dancing Glade, Bradley's House of Chance, and a dozen modistes and milliners with goods at triple prices from New York. Upon the trellised veranda of the breakers, 200 women stepped right, stepped left, wheeled, and slid in that then-celebrated calisthenic known as the double shuffle, while in half-time to the music, 2,000 bracelets clicked up and down on 200 arms. At the Everglades Club after dark, Paula and Lowell Thayer and Anson and a casual fourth played bridge with hot cards. It seemed to Anson that her kind, serious face was wan and tired. She had been around now for 5 years. He had known her for 3. 2 spades. Cigarette? Oh, I beg your pardon, by me. Bye. I'll double 3 spades. There were a dozen tables of bridge in the room, which was filling up with smoke. Anson's eyes met Paula's, held them persistently, even when Thayer's glance fell between them. What was bid? He asked abstractedly. Rose of Washington Square, sang the young people in the corners. I'm withering there in the basement air. The smoke banked like fog, and the opening of a door filled the room with blown swirls of ectoplasm. Little bright eyes streaked past the tables, seeking Mr. Conan Doyle among the Englishmen who were posing as Englishmen about the lobby. You could cut it with a knife. Cut it with a knife. A knife. At the end of the rubber, Paula suddenly got up and spoke to Anson in a tense, slow voice. With scarcely a glance at Lowell Thayer, they walked out the door and descended a long flight of stone steps. In a moment, they were walking hand in hand along the moonlit beach. Darling, darling. They embraced recklessly, passionately, in a shadow. Then Paula drew back her face to let his lips say what she wanted to hear. She could feel the words forming as they kissed again. Again she broke away, listening, but as he pulled her close once more, she realized that he had said nothing, only, darling, darling, in that deep, sad whisper that always made her cry. Humbly, obediently, her emotions yielded to him, and the tears streamed down her face, but her heart kept on crying. Ask me! Oh, Anson, dearest, ask me! Paula! Paula! The words wrung her heart like hands, and Anson, feeling her tremble, knew that emotion was enough. He need say no more, commit their destinies to no practical enigma. Why should he, when he might hold her so, biding his own time for another year? Forever? He was considering them both, her more than himself. For a moment, when she said suddenly that she must go back to her hotel, he hesitated, thinking first, this is the moment after all, and then, no, let it wait. She is mine. He had forgotten that Paula, too, was worn away inside with the strain of 3 years. Her mood passed forever in the night. He went back to New York next morning, filled with a certain restless dissatisfaction. Late in April, without warning, he received a telegram from Bar Harbor in which Paula told him that she was engaged to Lowell Thayer and that they would be married immediately in Boston. What he never really believed could happen had happened at last. Anson filled himself with whiskey that morning, and going to the office carried on his work without a break, rather with a fear of what would happen if he stopped. In the evening he went out as usual, saying nothing of what had occurred. He was cordial, humorous, unabstracted, but one thing he could not help. For 3 days, in any place, in any company, he would suddenly bend his head into his hands and cry like a child. End of section 1.